Yeah, it looks like this for those of you. All right, so it's okay to have your heads down at this point. You know, it's funny, at Shoal Creek, our lights are a lot dimmer than this. We don't have these beautiful sunlight around us, so it's really dark in the auditorium. And it's when you stand on the stage, you can see the blue glow in people's, as they check their Facebook while you're speaking. You would never, I know, so we're gonna walk through what it looks like here to engage a process of obedience-based disciple making, all right? And I want to use this little tool so that you're not writing furiously. You'll have all the stuff that you need right there inside that little tool. It looks like an app sort of on your phone. It's really written, you know, on the web to look like that. And we are in development of an actual app that this is going to roll into that. So if you like this and you're interested in staying in touch, there are ways to sign up for coaching tips down on the bottom right. You can put your email address in there, and we'll alert you when that app is available in the App Store and the Google Play Store. So I grew up in a world, and I got certified in a world to share what I thought was the love of Jesus with just about everything you can imagine. I grew up in a Southern Baptist home, or at least as a military family, we went to chapel, but my mom and dad had echoes of Southern Baptist in them. So I grew up in a lot of Southern Baptist training early on in my life, but then also as I left home, I went to college. I was involved in a thing that used to be called Campus Crusade for Christ. We now call it Cru, you know. Who would have thought that, you know, calling something crusade would be a hard thing to do in a Muslim world? Novel idea to change your name. And then I graduated from seminary, and I went off into local church work, and I went to Evangelism Explosion and got certified as an Evangelism Explosion trainer, learned how to ask the 2 diagnostic questions, and, you know, all that stuff led me to really be really good at sharing the gospel with people. But I realized at some point that people really didn't want to listen to me. And so it became frustrating as I attempted to help people understand why they needed to change the way they believed. And they just didn't want to change the way they believed. They didn't really believe me even in that process. And so all of a sudden I ran into a brick wall, and I had to kind of come to a realization that people weren't interested in what I believed, nor that were they interested in changing the way they believed. And I needed to rethink and refigure the way that I went about prosecuting this message that I thought was so dear and so necessary in people's lives. And so in this whole process, I ran across this thing we now call the discovery process. Some people call it DBS, Discovery Bible Study. We don't call it Discovery Bible Study at Shoal Creek simply because when we first began this back in 2008, we had a teacher in a faculty, she was an elementary school teacher. She got 6 of her teachers on her faculty that she began to pray for and invited to join a Discovery Bible Study. And so she invited them to come. 3 of them said yes, 3 of them said no way. And she was discouraged because ultimately the 3 that said yes were believers. They were already followers of Christ. The 3 that said no, she suspected might be hellbound. And so I said, how well do you know these gals? And she goes, well, we teach together. I mean, we meet every day. I know them well. I said, is there any chance you could take them out for drinks and Cokes and ask them why they didn't accept your invitation? She goes, yeah, I think I could do that. I said, I'll even pay for the Cokes. So she did. And this is what one of the girls said. She said, you asked me to come to a Bible study. And a Bible study is where Christians go to display their knowledge about the Bible. I don't know anything about the Bible. And so I don't need another place in my life to feel dumb. So I'm not coming. And so at that point, we realized using Discovery Bible Study was sort of dead on arrival. And so we called it a Discovery Group. And we made the pitch this way. Hey, would you be interested in joining a group where we're going to read the Bible together and discover what God has to say about life? And that's really our pitch. And in this process, my thinking changed. I went through another mind shift. In one area of my life, early on, I was trained to be a salesman for Jesus. Not much different than when we had door-to-door salesmen for Encyclopedia Britannica. We're trained to find ways to talk people into buying, large books they could put on their shelf that they would never read. That same kind of training, in a sense, same kind of persuasional training. And I began to morph into a world where I realized that I no longer had to be a salesman for Jesus. I just had to be a representative for God. I had to provide an opportunity for people to meet God face to face. And they weren't going to meet him in my words. They would meet him in his words. And so this opportunity to morph from being a salesman to being an event planner. And just plan an event where people could meet God. That's what we think of as a discovery group. And that discovery group is a very simple process. It's a very simple and a very repeatable process in which we put our trust in two things. We put our trust in the Word of God. We believe that it has the power in which it will transform people's lives, right? I mean, we believe that. We believe that without our words being added extra on top of it, right? That's a total lie. That's a total lie. I mean, we always have to add our opinion and our words and our explanations and our metaphors and all that kind of stuff. And we had to train ourselves to realize, no, we really do believe that the Word of God, the very words of God, are trustable. Second, there's a Spirit of God, right? Not just a force, it's a person. The third person of the Trinity, divine being. There is a Spirit who is capable of working in the lives of unregenerate people to bring them to faith. And so we took that, and then we placed it in the midst of unregenerate people. And so a discovery group is simply the process of helping people read the Bible, to discover what God's saying about life, to obey it and share it. Fundamentally, what Aichi just talked about in that video is how movements began. It's not the only thing about movements. Don't make the mistake that all a movement is a bunch of discovery groups. There is much more to a movement. There are more moving parts to a movement than just discovery groups. But it is fundamentally one of the key processes that has to take place. And so we're going to give you a chance to experience that in the next hour. We're going to put you in a group, and you're going to go through a passage. So before you get there, we want to give you just a little training of what it looks like to experience a discovery group. And we use at Shoal Creek 7 questions. Now, there are people who use 6 questions. There are some people who use 4 questions. There are people who use 10 questions. We don't fellowship with those people. That's a joke if you didn't get it. I mean, it's really not about the questions you use, because we're trying to get people to do 3 fundamental things in this process. We're trying to get them to hear from God by reading the Bible. We're trying to get them to identify an obedience statement on the passage that they have their eyes laid on. We're trying to get them to say, if this is God speaking, this is what I'm going to do. And we're trying to get them to share it with someone in their lives. Those 3 fundamental movements are what the 7 questions that we use at Shoal Creek are trying to motivate. Those are the same questions that the folks in Eastern Africa that only use 4 questions are trying to move. And so don't get hung up on which questions people use and stuff. Just understand, hear from God. Obey what it says. Share it with other people. Very simple process, all right? So let's go back to our app here. Don't you love the new iPhone? It's got to look at you. And let's touch discovery process, and there are your 7 questions. Most of you have already touched it. You're already there. So the first question is a very simple question. It's a question that's really meant to help people understand that there is a God in heaven. It asks something very simple. How do you, I'm sorry. Let me back up. This question 1 on this one is assuming you met last week. So we're going to assume you didn't meet last week. We're going to start with question 2. What are you thankful for? What are you thankful for? And you might think, well, why would ask that in a discovery group? It doesn't have to be asked necessarily. It really doesn't. You know, the only fundamental things that need to be asked is, let's read the Bible, let's identify something we're going to obey, and who are we going to share it with. Those are the fundamental, absolute, irreducible minimum to this process. But we start with, what are you thankful for? Simply because people need to learn to pray. In their unregenerate state, we're trying to help people understand there's a creator God in heaven. And so we want them to understand that prayer is simply being thankful. Now, invariably, you know, if you all are in a group, Christians get together, they always have to begin with one of 2 things. Either they have to sing or they have to pray. You know, or it's somehow unorthodox. And so invariably people will ask as we go along in this process, maybe it's 5 or 6 or 8 weeks into it, and we just start, hey, what are you thankful for this week? And someone will say, hey, you know, aren't we supposed to pray before we do this? Because as our brother John shared with us this morning, it is fundamentally harder to establish a self-repeating gospel in our country than it is in almost every other country in the world. Stan Parks, his older brother Kent, the smarter of the 2, is from Beyond back here. Wave at us, Kent. There we are, here, Kent. Kent's with Beyond. If you're interested in going overseas, see that guy. But Stan once said to me, and we're talking, and if you've ever been around any of the training that David Watson has done, he's got 23 fundamental principles of DMM. I mean, frankly, there aren't 23 fundamental principles of anything, really, you know? I mean, there are 5 fundamental principles, maybe 7, might be 10, but not 23. You have to know David to understand that. But one of those is expect the greatest results in the most difficult places. That's why when we see what's swept across sub-Saharan Africa and we see 400,000 people who are followers of Islam, you know, begin to become followers of Jesus, we expect those results in some of the hardest places because that's what we see. Stan says to me, you know, David's principle about expecting the hardest, the best results or the most amazing results in the most difficult places, he says, maybe you, pointing to me, are working in the most difficult place there is to work. Because the people I work with live in suburbs of Kansas City. They have absolutely no need in the world. They have more things than they have ever wanted in their life. And so they don't need, water. I can't throw up a clinic, to give them a health clinic that they'll come to. You have to come up with all kinds of goofy things to really find the needs. Now, I do believe that the people I work with fundamentally have a poverty of purpose. They are dying for lack of purpose in this world. And if you can identify that and reach that, you can reach them. But they're very, very difficult to reach. So when we get these people together and we begin to read the Bible together, we just simply ask them, of course, what are you thankful for? Because we want to turn their heads upward. We want them to understand there's a God in heaven. Who are you thankful to? So this person ultimately asks, shouldn't we pray? Because they know that Christians sort of pray at different times. And we'll say to them, well, actually, believe it or not, when you answered that question last week about what are you thankful for, you actually were praying. And it's like, what? I said, yeah, well, so let's try it. Here, why don't you open in prayer today? I don't know how to pray. Well, just tell God what you're thankful for. Let's just answer this first question. What are you thankful for? Instead of tell me, why don't you tell God? Does that mean you look up? I don't know. I mean, we know the Bible says you need to close your eyes, right? So, it's like you help them figure out, how do I start a dialogue with the Creator? Well, one of the things is you tell them what you're thankful for. You create a sense of gratitude in your life. And so we just simply start. It's an easy question to start with. It's an easy way to break the chit-chat that's going on in a group. What are you thankful for? You just butt in and ask it. And people tend to not be offended because it's oftentimes it can be an easy question to ask. Second question, number 3, is what's the biggest challenge you're facing today? So we also know that a part of praying is being authentic with God, sharing with God what's going on in your life. And so we ask them to share this. Now, again, this is not fundamentally necessary in a discovery group, but we find that because we are attempting to plant the gospel in an already connected social group, it draws them together in a deeper way. Most Americans live isolated lives. They don't share very many critical details of their life with very many people. And so building this obedience-based community, we simply ask them this question. What's the greatest challenge in your life? Now, with the fear of being accused of being sexist, let me enter into a difficulty that we have. We find a lot more success with females than we do with men. And in those groups with females, when you ask this question, it can literally be a nightmare. Because we're working with a lot of middle to upper class white Americans, females, many of whom have set their careers on the side so they can stay home for 6 to 8 years while they have kids and get them into school. And so when you invite them to join a group, oftentimes they are starved for adult conversation. And God forbid you would ask a question like, what challenges are you facing today? That can be 2 hours of an answer. It just is amazing. So we have group leaders who actually don't ask that question sometimes, but because it becomes a time management issue. People often ask, how many people should you have in a discovery group? Well, really, your culture is determinant of that. What we've discovered is we've got 7 questions here. So the second group you meet, you're going to ask about what did you learn last week, what did you do about it, who did you share with. So that first question is going to come into play. 7 questions. On average, people take about 3 minutes to answer every question. Now remember, I'm not good at math, so you're going to have to do this yourself. So we've got 3 questions times 7 questions times 3 minutes, all right? So we're at 21, right? Times how many people do you want in your group? How much time do you have? We find the average American might give you 90 minutes max. So really, once you get to 5 people, you're stuffing a group full if you're dealing with Americans. If you're dealing with Westerners in that sense. People who aren't serving the chief rival god of time, you don't have to worry about it. So we keep our groups 5 and below, all right? What challenge? And if you notice the way we ask this, we have crafted this over the years as we've learned, what's the biggest challenge? Not what's challenging you. Sometimes we'll even, what's the one biggest challenge? We actually had a group one time of ladies, and one of the ladies in the group started bringing an egg timer to the group. And when the question would ask, she would turn it to 3 minutes and let it start ticking. So, again, be careful. What's the biggest challenge facing you today? Now we get down to the meat of the issue. Question 4. We find also this is a difficult question to be asked in a Western environment. Not everyone asks this, but we happen to, simply because we believe that an other-centered life is a valuable component to having a cross-centered life. That people need to get their eyes not only upward, but outward quickly as they begin to move toward the cross. And so we ask this question: do you know someone that you could serve? And oftentimes we'll say we could serve this week. I'm mindful of that this morning. I got a call from my wife. My middle daughter, my youngest daughter, third child, is moving today. Thank God this conference is going on this weekend. She's moving into a new house, she and her husband and her 3 kids. And so, invariably in the suburbs, that question will be asked, and somebody will be moving, somebody will be sick, someone needs childcare, someone needs transportation to and from school, some neighbors got cancer, somebody is out of town on vacation and need their yards mowed. I mean, there's a whole host of issues that can come up where people in the suburbs who can pay for things have to learn to depend on other people for things. And so we find this question to be really important in the lives of people who are overblessed in life. And then we get down to the 5th question, is where we put the scriptures. What's God say? And we simply there begin to read the passage of Scripture. Now, our process is to read it twice. And we'll ask, and if you'll notice, if we want to back up on this thing and go back, notice the reading plan, if you touch that. Our reading plan is really a creation to Christ reading plan, but it doesn't look like that because it starts with trust A and trust B. We have these things we call the 7 journeys. And the first journey is moving from earner to heir in your relationship with God. It's really creation to Christ. And so if you touch A, you'll notice that the passages come down. And if you touch the passage, Genesis 1, you're clipped over to Bible Gateway. This little device that we've built here happened simply because we had a leader who was a Ruby rule follower. She wanted to do everything just right. And she hated having a sheet of paper in her hand, and no one else had a sheet of paper. She didn't want to make sheets of paper with all this stuff for her. So her husband built her this, so she would have it all on her phone. Little did we realize what a great multiplication tool this would become, because guess what? Every American always carries their phone with them all the time. I mean, God forbid that you would leave home without your phone, right? And that you can't check it about every 2 or 3 minutes to make sure that something really important hasn't come in. Or maybe you missed something. And so everyone's always got their phone. And so here we have this device that's already in everyone's hands. And so now they're sitting in a group and they're going to Bible Gateway and they're discovering that they carry around a Bible with them. And so we have them read the passage. We also encourage them to understand in this Bible Gateway. It's a website, not an app. In there, you can get 2 different versions. And so typically, the New International Version comes up first. That's the approved version of the Bible, I think, right? At least in Grand Rapids. I'm not sure about Chicago, But we also have our leader then go to another version. We never let people read the Message. Never, ever let people read the Message. And that's because once Eugene Peterson's spoken, no one else can speak. Because the second part of this process, after they read the passage, we're going to ask the group to put the passage in their own words. It's hard to say anything after you've read the Message, right? I mean, Eugene Peterson has said it so well that it's like what he said. We don't want that. We want people getting their fingerprints on the Bible. We want them to take this story, we want them to retell this story, and as they retell the story, we want them to understand what's going on in that story. And if they clip to the Eugene Peterson version of it, they're not have going to got, their fingerprints won't be on it. And so we read it twice. I always typically will say to someone, it's like I'll look at someone and say, hey, Bill, when we finish this, I'm going to ask you to start retelling the story. And so we're going to read it twice, give you a chance. You know, I know the pressure's on. It's going to be tough. But I think you can do it, Bill, right? And Bill always goes, yes. You know, it doesn't matter, whoever you pick. But I want them to be thinking about the story as it's read, because they're going to then start this process of retelling what happened. Like Genesis 1 is a long, long passage. We attempt to keep all of our passages at about 10 verses, simply because as we retell this thing, it's hard for Americans to maintain their attention past 10 verses. Now, that's difficult in some of the stories, especially in the first half of the Bible. It's really difficult. We have a Leviticus 4 in our reading plan. I don't know if you've ever, been through Leviticus 4, but it's like the passage that people, PETA, you all know PETA, not the bread we ate today, but the, organization that loves animals. I mean, in Leviticus 4, everything's dying. Every animal you can imagine is just being slaughtered. And it's amazing when you have suburban Americans, who probably have a heart for animals. They've got a dog at home or a cat or a goldfish or something, and everything's being, just bludgeoned in this passage. But what's fascinating about it is when they get to the cross and they read the passage on the cross, I've had a guy say to me, wow, now I know why Jesus had to die. I look back to that Leviticus passage, I realized all that blood going on. He says, I hated the Bible because of that. I didn't ever want to read the Bible again, but I kept going. And when we got to the cross, I realized what was happening there. Something happened bad and something had to die. Something happened bad and something had to die. Something happened bad and something had to die. That's what Leviticus 4 is about. He said, I realize I'm bad and Jesus had to die. I get it now. I really get it now. That's what happens in this discovery process, this opportunity to let people hear from God themselves. They hear the words of God. The Spirit of God gets operational in their lives. I can't control the mysticism that happens there. I don't know what's going on, the Ordo Salutis. I'm not sure if I'm an infralapsarianism or superlapsarian. I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. But I do know that there's an operation that I can't control, that there is a huge mixture of God's Word and the power of His Spirit in the life of an unregenerate person as they slowly march themselves toward the cross in the power of God's Spirit. And so they read the passage. They read it twice. They retell the passage as a group. They make sure that they've got it down. And then they start asking, simple questions. What does this say about God? What does this say about me? And the critical question is, what am I going to do about it? What am I going to do about it? The next question. And we refer to that in the Shoal Creek vernacular, we refer to it as an I will statement. If this is God speaking, what am I going to do about it? We kind of help people quantify that by saying, in the next 24 to 48 hours, if this is God speaking, what would you do? And we just sort of help them get across this idea that I'm going to take these words from God and I'm going to make them operational in my life. And sometimes the applications are bizarre. I remember Genesis 1, reading this guy, 70 years old, Mike. He's just contracted cancer, and he's decided that he probably needs to find some spiritual something in his life. And so we're reading Genesis 1, and Mike says, he gets down to the end, and Mike's kind of a crotchety old guy. He's just not much for anything. And he gets down to the very end of this passage. Well, I guess my entire life, I have hated tree huggers. I think they're a bunch of idiots. But if this passage says what I think it says, God created the world, and I guess I better take care of it. So I'm going to go to City Hall tomorrow, and I'm going to get a recycling bin. And I'm going to start recycling. That was Mike's first step toward the cross. Slow, small, unique steps of obedience. God speaks, I trust, I move, things happen. And so the I will statement is simple, and it's very, very important. It's foundational in this process to understand if I'm going to create this obedience-based disciple-making culture, I'm going to call people to obedience. I'm going to ask them, what are you going to do about it? And last, who are you going to share it with? Looking for a name here. Now, I know that many people get excited about DBS, Discovery Bible Study. Many Christians get excited about the fact that in a Bible study, they're asked to obey something. That's usually not the case, right? We're really excited about the fact that maybe we learned something new, a new thought or a new idea. But to actually do something about it becomes really exciting. The next step is not so exciting for most Christians. And it's this idea of who are you going to share it with? Who are you going to share with what God is doing in your life? And we ask people to actually come up with a name of a person. I mean, it does make people very uncomfortable. And oftentimes, when people are looking at the discovery process, they will boot this. And they will kick out the entire sense of multiply. It goes out the window. It's critical that this be kept in and we hold everyone's feet to the fire. You and I, as believers, have been taught to share our faith with people. We've been taught to approach people with sort of a persuasive power toward helping people change their beliefs. We do not know how to talk about our spiritual journey in normal circumstances. Everything that moves out of us that's Jesus-wise has sort of got this pressure to it. But it's not that way. If you live in Chicago, I mean, you're excited about the Cubs, right? We are not excited about the Royals in Kansas City. We can't wait for the baseball season to be over. You know, we're excited about the Chiefs, you know, that kind of stuff. We have the ability to talk about all kinds of things in our lives, but there's somehow Satan has convinced us that when it comes to sharing our spiritual journey, it's something that shouldn't be done. And we're going to have to relearn, what does it look like to share our spiritual journey? What does it look like to be able to understand that I can talk normally about the presence of Jesus in my life without feeling like I'm shoving Jesus down someone's throat? You know, people are not really afraid of God. They're not afraid of Jesus. They're not even afraid of the Bible. They're afraid of you and me. They're afraid of Christians. I mean, we just have such a bad reputation, and so we're going to have to learn to work at what it looks like to share normally about what God is doing in my life. You know, to be able to stuff into a conversation someplace. Hey, yeah, we were reading this passage in Leviticus in the Bible, and someone's going to look at you like, what? I didn't even know there's a, what? How do you spell that? Well, it's this passage about everything dying, all these animals being sacrificed. Why were you doing that? Well, you know, the Bible's like, I mean, it's an important book, and maybe we ought to read it. I just thought maybe I'd get into this group and read it. So this bunch of people, and we meet together regularly, and we read the Bible. Wow, that's weird. Well, it's not as weird as you might think. You know, I mean, actually, the Bible has some cool things to say. Really? Like what? Well, like all these animals dying. I mean, the Jews were like peculiar people, you know? God is like working with them, and someone does something bad, and to rectify something, bad that happened, something has to die for it. It's like, it's like an eye for an eye thing going on here. Oh, really? That's fascinating. It's a normal conversation. It doesn't have to go anywhere. You don't have to end with saying, would you like to pray and receive Jesus? That's just a friend of mine. I don't know if I can say this without narking him out, but a friend of mine he's not here. He's not in this group, but he's head of a major mission organization that's headquartered in Kansas City. And he calls me and says, I want to experience this. I want to know what you guys are doing. Have you got a discovery group that we can be in? So he and his wife in a group, and they're going through this group, and this couple that's leading it is so rough and so raw. They've come to faith. The husband and his former wife had quintuplets, and 4 of those kids died and 1 lived. And Gracie is this precious 14-year-old girl who's blind, and all of her siblings died at birth except for her. And so along comes another gal in his life, and they get married, and it's messy, and it's a horrid situation. But they began to read the Bible for themselves and discovered who God was, and their life began to change. And so I took a risk and put this guy into this group with this couple, because I figured if they're ever going to get it, he's going to get it straight up. And so it was fascinating, because went out to lunch with this guy, and he says, wow, he says, I've never been, and this guy is a Dallas Seminary graduate, okay? Now, I know that this would never happen from a Trinity graduate. But this guy's a Dallas Seminary graduate. He says to me, he says, I'm 55 years old. I have never in my life been in a Bible study where I was asked one week to identify what I was going to do about the truth, to come back the next week and asked if I had done it. Never in my life has that happened. Never. Now, my guess is that in his education, he probably translated John 14 and 15 from the original languages. What about if you love me, obey me, did he not get? How do we miss that kind of stuff? That's just freaking crazy. I don't understand it. Jesus didn't say, if you love me, agree with me. If you love me, know what I say. If you love me, repeat in flowered words what I said. No, he said, just do what I say. That's all I ask. Let's face it. If you're facing a difficult problem in your life, if you're facing, something that you need the wisdom of God from, and you have a chance to hear from God himself, and he tells you what he thinks, wouldn't you do it? Of course you would. Of course you would. But somehow we've failed to prosecute our Christianity in a way that wants to hear from God and do what he says. And so we ask people to identify someone they're going to share with. This guy identifies his neighbor. And so he drives in his driveway. President of, mission organization drives up in his driveway, and his neighbor is getting out of the car. And they have just read the passage on Caleb in the first half of the Bible. And God is impressed on him, his neighbor, because his neighbor is 70 years old, still works. He's a faithful worker, works really hard. And he says, that neighbor of mine has the spirit of Caleb. And so he gets out of his car, he sees his neighbor getting out of his car, he walks across the street to have this, what he thinks of is a very, very difficult conversation. And he says, hey, John. He says, hey, how you doing, man? He says, doing good. He says, this may sound weird, but I just wanted to tell you thank you. He says, what for? He says, I just want to tell you that I'm in this group, and we're reading the Bible together, and And we just read the story of this guy named Caleb in the Bible. He's really old, and and he lives like he's young. He is charging uphill. He is faithful, and he's got this spirit of life in him that's just full. And he says, when I think about a human, I think about the spirit of Caleb. You demonstrate that for me in my life. And I just want to say thank you for that. And his neighbor looked at him. I'm sure, he thought, wow, weird Jesus freak or something, But it was such a genuine conversation with the two. It started an opportunity for a group to begin and for one couple in a neighborhood to have another couple in a neighborhood over to begin reading the Bible for themselves. He had identified someone. I'm going to share with John. And so, again, last question, vitally important. Let me go back to the top. The first question is simply, what'd you do with what you learned last week? And who'd you share with? Every week, it's an accountable structure. Life change happens in authentic, accountable relationships. And so we have people come back, and they come back, and oftentimes you can start with that. If you don't start with, what are you thankful about? You can start with, okay, how'd you do with what you did last week? And you have to get used to sort of crickets type thing, Anything? But people begin to warm up. And we discover that after about 5 or 6 weeks, people actually do, if you regularly ask that question, they begin to get the fact that you're for real. Oh, you mean I really do have to share with someone? Yeah, you do. Oh, you mean I really have to do the obedience? Yeah, you do. We're serious about this. And people self-select out of these groups. People ask, well, what do you do with people who don't do the obedience statements? Well, I can tell you that that's probably happening when you're trying to do the discovery process with Christians. Only Christians disobey. Non-believers will either obey or leave, and you realize you're working with the right people when someone leaves and someone stays. You don't waste your time. You don't not love those people. You still love them or relate to them, but you're not going to spend time in a spiritual atmosphere with them to do discovery because they're not ready yet. And so you just begin to work with the people who obey. And you just keep moving and keep moving and keep moving in that process. And something amazing happens in the lives of people. I had a guy come to me outside a coffee shop. We're having this little thing at a coffee shop, and he puts his finger on my chest and he says, where's a guy like me go to get his questions answered? And he was Italian. He was from Buffalo, New York, and he's kind of scary. And I said, well, I'm starting a group, at the grocery store next Friday at 5:30 in the morning. I wanted to see if he'd really get up and had really, and he did. He came, and 3 other guys came. And this was actually before I had run into the Bhojpuri movement and Watson and my friends in Africa and all that kind of stuff. All I knew to do is read the Bible. And so we read the book of Romans. And I watched 3 men come to faith reading the book of Romans. Not me telling them the Roman road, them reading the book of Romans, all 16 chapters. In front of my eyes. When, I don't know. But today, if I introduce you to all 3 of those guys, there would be no doubt in your mind that they are fire-breathing, disciple-making gentlemen. I didn't give them the answers. I let them discover it for themselves. Now, they ask me lots of questions, and frankly, as a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary, I've got a lot of answers in me waiting to get out. But I had to learn the discipline of the fact that facilitating a discovery group is really about asking questions and not about giving answers. I had to evaluate my facilitation of groups, understanding that the less I talked, the better the group was. Because oftentimes my education would get in the way of God speaking. I have eloquent answers. I love my answers. But I am a depraved individual. I'm self-deluded. And the power that exists in my words is infinitesimal, if even measurable, based on the power in God's word. And so I had to learn to shut up and let God speak. Now, I did interact with the text myself with them and come up with a I will statement and all those kind of things. I wasn't silent, but I did not bring my words to bear on the text to explain in their lives what it meant. I let God do that. 7 simple questions. When people say, I can't be a disciple maker, I said, can you ask a question? Yeah, I can do that. All right, do you have a phone? Yeah, I've got a phone. Well, go to the dgapp.org. Sounds like the Google there, the dgapp.org, right? Oh, see those 7 questions? Can you ask those questions in a group? Yeah, you can be a disciple maker. You actually can be a part of the process of helping someone learn to grow in their obedience to everything Jesus has said. And that, over time, is much like compound interest. When people stack acts of obedience on top of acts of obedience on top of acts of obedience on top of acts of obedience, something happens in the depths of their soul. Because we think of obedience as legalism, but obedience is simply a matter of trust. It's acting as if God says it was true. I am trusting what God says, and I'm moving. And as I move and I move and I move and I move, something mystical happens in the depths of my soul. I don't understand when they cross the line of faith. We used to say that word, cross the line of faith, and now we think of it as the zone of faith. We're not sure where they cross that line, but something happens and they do. So you're going to have the opportunity now to go into some groups and learn what it looks like to experience a discovery group if you haven't already. So I'm going to ask the good Dr. Dave Heidenreich, another man who is educated beyond his own intelligence, to come and lead us.
All right, thank you, Roy. That was great. Let's just show our appreciation to Brother Roy. Thank you. I appreciated very much a lot of things that you shared, Roy, and especially the way you started off by saying that different people have different questions. We didn't spend a lot of time comparing notes before Roy's talk, and I didn't know that he was going to share the questions out of that app. And you will find in your folder another set of 7 questions that we were going to recommend that you use right now. I will give groups freedom. You can choose the app or you can choose what you have in your folder. People often ask me, well, which is the right one? And of course, the answer is, this is the right one. The questions are just meant to be aids to get you into this and to help you to read it, understand it, and obey it. All right? So you can choose if you want to use the 7-question list in there or the one on the app. Of course, I prefer this one, but, we aren't going to argue that. All of them have strengths and weaknesses. One of the things we are going to do, though, is throw a little bit of a curveball to you, because we know that many of you have done a lot of discovery groups already. In fact, you've led them with Muslims and who knows all that you've been involved in. And so when I'm training groups, I always start with Genesis chapter 1 or Psalm chapter 1, because those are where I always start with pre-believers. That's pretty much what people are doing around the world in order to allow people to see the creation to Christ chronology, so they understand why they need a Messiah, why they need to believe in Jesus. But you guys already know why you need Jesus, and so we're going to not do a chronological one, and we're going to try to get into a passage that isn't going to be an easy one, and that's this, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. You might want to write this down. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 31 to 11:1. Now, I know there's an awkward chapter break just before 11:1. It's going to make you wonder why I did it the way I did it, but I think the people that put that in there needed to talk to me first, you know? They should have put it in at 11:2. Anyway, hopefully you'll agree with me at the end, whether you do or not. Those are the verses that we want you to look at in your discovery group. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 31 to 11:1. Those of you that end up in the gym, the eating area, are going to have little papers that have already got those verses printed on them. Those of you that are unfortunate to be in the overflow area with me, we're just going to use our scrolls straight out of our Bibles. Okay? Now, we've had some logistical issues at lunch. Some of us had to have a short time of fasting and working on our patience and long suffering. But we think we've worked that out for dinner. We have a bit longer time for dinner, and we've worked on our systems and with other factors, and we think that we're going to get things better for dinner. So don't get discouraged and decide to go to Arby's or something, because it's going to be better here. Right after the discovery group, those of you that are already in the lunchroom area, you're just going to stay there and then start lining up. Those of you that are with me in room 207, we're going to find our way down there, and I think the plan as of now, until it changes perhaps, is that we're going to each just bring our chair that we were sitting in, and then we're going to join around a table wherever we can find one, because we're not supposed to be eating all over the building. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, the big question is, everybody wants to know, is who gets to go up to room 207 with me? I know you're asking that. And the answer is, those of you that live in the burbs of Chicago. If we've got 60 people, then from the burbs of Chicago, please join me in room 207. I just want to see a show of hands now out of people that are here. If you live in the suburbs, north, south, east, west, whatever, I guess there aren't any eastern ones. Yeah, let me see your hands real high. Okay, so the first 60 to make it into a chair in 207, you're in the overflow room with me. The rest of you just go straight down to the dining area. Take your Bible and valuables and whatever, and then we're going to have dinner right after this, and then we're going to reconvene after dinner for the final session tonight. So don't go home after dinner or you'll be missing out. Thank you very much.